All right, welcome everyone to the second session of 4 of TAI's Cybersecurity Intern series. Appreciate everybody joining us today. If you missed our first series, my name is Molly Ross. I am the Vice President of Operations here at the Technology Association of Iowa. We are honored to bring you another slate of incredible guests to share their knowledge and expertise in the cybersecurity industry. So thank you as well to our speakers today. As I mentioned, this is the second of 4. If you happen to miss our first session a couple weeks ago, it is available on our website at technologyiowa.org. So please feel free to check that out and catch up with us. Before we get started, I do want to say, please, as you know, attendees, you all are muted and your cameras are off, but we would love to hear from you. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to drop some in the chat. We want to make sure that you're getting the information that you're here looking for. So please feel free to plug questions in as they come to you. And now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today, Mr. Morgan. Carly Morgan is the Director of Cybersecurity and Privacy at Kingland Systems.
There we go. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be helping out with this session today, moderating. We've got a really good topic, I think, some great speakers. I'm, as Molly said, work at Kingland Systems. We're a local homegrown Iowa company. We've been members of TAI for many years, and it's been an amazing partnership working with the organization. We develop and host custom SaaS solutions for clients, primarily in the public accounting and banking and capital markets industries. So technologies in our blood. We have, as I mentioned, some great speakers today. We're going to get started with Zach Furst, and then Sam Wolf will join in. Zach is the Chief Information Security Officer for the University of Iowa and Iowa Hospitals and Clinics, which I think is going to factor into his topic, which we'll get to in a minute. Since joining the University of Iowa in 2015, Zach's worked as a security analyst, architect, operations director, and deputy CISO for the information security team, and now has taken over as the CISO. And at University of Iowa has a team of about 20 professionals working on the security team, and is responsible for pretty much everything, all aspects of the cybersecurity program, risk assessment, security policy, configuration, security event detection, monitoring, etc. And Zach is going to be primarily talking about ransomware, which is a hot button topic, and I'm very excited to hear what he has to say. And as I mentioned, I think that's an especially critical topic for hospitals. So I'll have some questions there from myself, at least. Sam Wolf comes to us from Principal Financial Group. He leads the company's third-party cyber risk function there, which I can imagine at a company the size of Principal is that there's a lot going on there. Sam also serves on the board of directors for the Third Party Risk Association and the Cybersecurity Advisory Council at Iowa State. So we've got some Iowa State and Hawkeyes represented here today. Sam holds several industry certifications and has experience across other functions of security as well: identity and access management, product ownership, digital experiences development, and consulting. Sam, this is you've been at Principal since you were an intern, but you did not start out in technology originally as your first career, right? You were a production welder, fun fact, and found your home in technology eventually.
Absolutely, that's correct.
So as you may have gathered from the introductions, Sam is going to be talking about that third-party risk function. And the topic here is emerging trends. And both of these don't seem like emerging topics. Everybody here on the call, if you're in cybersecurity, you've heard of ransomware. But this is a continuously evolving threat landscape, and ransomware is constantly changing. Zach, talk to us about where you see ransomware going, what it is, and how it's impacting you and your organization, your hospital.
No, thanks, Morgan. Yeah, I think it's a really critical topic to talk about. I did want to set the stage a little bit. before we get into the specifics of ransomware. And I also just wanted to comment, I appreciate, Sam's changing career. I was very similar. I was a political science major when I was in college, came into IT and then cybersecurity a little bit later. So for those of you that are looking at that saying, well, geez, I did major in cybersecurity, or I am, interested in this in, my early 20s, you're just really ahead of the power curve. So, you're doing great there, but there's always an opportunity to shift careers, as evidenced by Sam and I. So I wanted to talk kind of big picture a little bit about how we think about cyber attacks and kind of the motivations behind it, and then what that kind of leads into in terms of ransomware. When we generally think about cybersecurity and the things that we have to be worried about, we can kind of bucket them into two different categories. We can say that there's attacks, and then there's kind of the natural events and things that can happen in an environment, natural disasters, et cetera, that can also have an impact to confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. But that's not necessarily what we're focused on today, but it's still a component of cybersecurity. Within those attacks, we tend to kind of think about different types of attacks having different motivations. And so there may be certain attacks that are more ideological. This could be from, I think the term that was used in the previous Security Plus certification a couple of years ago was script kiddies. People that are just doing it to see if they can. There's also things like hacktivism. People doing something for a political cause. You might even have unintentional users that are doing something that they don't realize that they're doing something that's causing an issue. And then you have more of those kind of cybercrime and nation state activities. And cybercrime starts to kind of blend into that financial component rather than ideological. And so if we think about how just industry and our economy in general has moved towards the internet over the last 25, 30 years, criminal activity has kind of followed suit, right? It's become a much larger part of our economy and our industry than where it was 25 years ago. And with that, there's been this realization that criminals could have a profit off of something that at the time or from their assessment was relatively low risk, but provided a huge financial payoff. And so that's kind of the genesis of cyber criminal activity, as we call it, was, hey, these things we can do with large financial payoff, and it's relatively low risk. And why was it low risk? Well, first of all, the technology is still relatively immature. A lot of organizations and industries didn't really think about the financial risk associated with cyber attacks and things like that. We also didn't see a whole lot of government involvement. The governments were focused on other nation states and maybe weren't as focused at criminal activity. And then you've probably heard this before or seen somebody say this, oh, well, that's just the internet, and not necessarily realizing the direct financial or operational impacts that a cyber attack can have. And so because of that, they kind of had an opportunity, these cybercrime groups, to make these pretty substantial gains and perform these cyber attacks with relatively low risk. Now, one thing about cybercrime groups is that they tend to mirror legitimate businesses. And so in a lot of cases, you'll see groups that are offering services for a price. You've probably heard in the news, the concept of like a ransomware gang, right? This is a group that isn't necessarily performing the entire attack chain, but is really focused on ransomware, or what we've sometimes said as ransomware as a service. And in some cases, you have some groups that are doing more of that attack chain in-house. In some cases, you have groups that are doing less of that attack chain in-house. So people then tend to ask kind of what's the financial payoff? And there's a couple of payoffs. The first and the most obvious is the ransomware itself. I'm going to hold your data at ransom, and you're going to give me a financial payout for me to release that information. There's also the financial payoff of just sensitive data, right? Acquiring sensitive data is valuable from a financial perspective within these kind of dark market economies, criminal economies. One of the data points, and this is why it's really important to healthcare. One of the data points that I've heard over the last year, and I wish I could source this, but I don't remember where I heard it, but you could go look this up and probably find better information, was that it was going for about $4, you could purchase a credit card number on the dark web. For about $250, you could purchase an entire EMR record. And so the cost, the financial benefit for an attacker to gain access to personal health, protected health information and EMR records was significantly higher than scooping up credit card information or getting people's driver's license or social security number. And that's why we tended to start to see healthcare be targeted. The other dynamic that we started to see was that in the past, user-focused attacks were much more prevalent. So people would be directly targeted as a user to provide their information, provide sensitive data, or to be encrypted, to be ransomware. And that was there was less benefit for an attacker. So there was lower payoff kind of per attack. And so it just wasn't a really kind of financially sustainable model for a lot of these cyber criminal groups. So that kind of created the situation that we're in today. We have these cyber criminal groups that knew they wanted to make money off of people's or organizations' sensitive data. They knew they could do that in one of two ways. They could either steal the data or they could hold it at ransom. And they knew that organizations were probably a better target than targeting specific individuals. And so now that we've started to kind of see that mature over the last couple of years, questions like which sort of businesses or industries should we focus on? Well, can we focus on industries that value their data more, where the data can't be changed as quickly? You could change your credit card number with relative ease. The card information that they stole, is canceled. That's a lot harder to do with personal information or protected health information. That's a lot harder to do with cutting edge research or some of the broader financial information that we see in the financial services industry. So they tended to start kind of focusing on these higher reward industries. But it pretty much became ubiquitous. We're seeing this across all industries now. We see construction companies that have to deal with ransomware in the same way that we're having to see this from big box stores in major markets, as well as healthcare, as well as governments. It's becoming pretty ubiquitous. So conceptually, what is ransomware when we're talking about it? There's a little bit of a misnomer in that ransomware is substantially different than a lot of other cyber attacks that we see. And until they encrypt the data, it's not really that different. The attack chain is very similar in the sense that an attacker gains access to an environment, moves laterally and escalates privileges until they can access that sensitive data, at which point then they encrypt that data. And in some cases, they also at the same time exfiltrate that data. And then that's the point at which they hold that data at ransom and expect the organization to contact them to either pay that information or sell that information on the black market. A lot of people will then ask, well, why would I pay a ransom if that information has already been stolen by a cyber criminal group? Aren't they just going to sell my data anyways? And there's kind of a unique honor among thieves that's occurred within this environment. They have a financial incentive to be true to their word that they won't sell that information, because if they do, it kind of lessens the likelihood that future attacks that people will be willing to pay a ransom. And so what the model that they're kind of stuck with or that they're sitting in is, hey, we can get a huge reward from an organization by getting them to pay a ransom. And if they do, we'll give them their data back and move on to the next organization. And if they don't give us that huge payout, then we can turn around and sell that information if possible. And so that's why you kind of see, a little bit of unique dynamic within kind of the ransomware trend. Tied to that, the other interesting dynamic is that they want to make things as easy as possible for their victims in terms of being able to respond to and pay these ransoms. And so what we've seen is a lot of these ransomware as a service groups have surprisingly good tech support. They have chats that you can contact to say, hey, how do I get Bitcoin in order to pay you? And they will walk you through all the steps, and they're responsive 24/7.
Who would have ever thought we'd be seeing call centers devoted to helping you
Right.
pay ransomware?
Right. And we've actually seen some organizations where their sole focus is acting as that call center for ransomware gangs. So it's kind of a, distributed business model, the same way an organization may, send their customer support to a third party. So it does kind of track very similarly to what we see in industry. The other thing that we see is as cybercriminal groups succeed within an industry or within a region, other groups will notice the benefit, kind of the financial gain that they received. They'll hear that this group got a $10 million payout, or, that they got $5 million from this organization, and it kind of feeds on itself. And so that's one of the things that happened over the last couple of years within healthcare, was that organizations were either stuck or didn't have any good options, and maybe paid these ransomware groups a significant financial payout. And then other groups said, well, I want to take advantage of that too, and they started targeting the industry. And so we started to see some of that dynamic where it's almost like a feeding frenzy of sharks, that they've started to see that an industry is vulnerable, and then they start to really focus on it.
It does feel like the medical industry has that double whammy of, one, that data you talked about, it can't be changed. They have to protect that data. It's not like they can just, we'll just change everybody's, credit card numbers. They feel like they have to pay, but also the disruption to operations. If some of these systems and data is encrypted and not available to the hospital, hospitals have to operate. So is that kind of impacting their vulnerability and their willingness to pay?
Absolutely. And we've seen that with other industries where, if you're operationally critical data has been encrypted, you're not just losing the money from paying out, a ransom. You're losing money day over day that you aren't operational. There's varying estimates, but what we've seen from other organizations within healthcare is that cost could be, anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million to $5 million a day in lost revenue as you're dealing with a ransomware incident. So you can imagine if it takes you a month to recover, I can't even do math that fast, but that's a sizable loss for a hospital, that they have to figure out how to recover. So yeah, there's definitely kind of a criticality component. The last thing I'll bring up is just kind of what's happening now. We're seeing a couple of things. The first is that nation states are starting to realize that there's this financial benefit. So within the industry, we've started to see some nation state actors start to take advantage of similar techniques and kind of act as ransomware groups to gain, make money for their country, or for the illicit activities that they may be doing for their government. There's also a benefit in that they can kind of provide cover for criminal organizations within their borders. And so there's this kind of nexus between cyber criminal groups and nation state actors that we're starting to see play a bigger role. The other impact to that is kind of the emergence or reemergence of wiper malware. And so you may have heard about this. I think the one that made the news the biggest was the NotPetya campaign, probably 6 years ago at this point, or 8 years ago. But the idea that we're going to follow the exact same steps as a ransomware group, we're going to encrypt data, but we're then going to throw away the key. And the intent is not to make money off of the attack, but to just destroy those industries. That operational cost that we talked about, increase the cost of doing business for those industries and organizations. So we're starting to see more of that, or see that kind of regain prevalence. And so that, it's a challenging environment. And the last thing I'll bring up that's kind of tied to that is, and this is where Sam's going to kind of talk about it, is, everybody is using third parties and using vended applications within their environment. There's no environment where everything is 100% homegrown. And so threat actors are realizing, hey, rather than me targeting a specific organization, I can target a vendor that provides support to a whole class of organizations. And, I increase my bang for my buck, right? There's a lower cost, higher reward from that dynamic. And so that's kind of the new dynamic that we're seeing is, organizations that are trying to conduct ransomware attacks through the supply chain. And so with that, I'll kind of stop here since I'm bleeding into Sam's talk here, and I'll turn it over to Sam to talk about third-party risk.
I mean, couldn't even have planned that segue better. Morgan, do you have anything in the middle there? I didn't want to make sure you had anything to add.
No, I do appreciate that segue though, because I think there is, so much of security is tied together, and the attack vectors for someone that their end goal is ransomware. This is why we care about third-party risk management.
Yeah, no, perfect. Well, thank you, of course, to you, Morgan, for moderating, Zach, and then to the TIA for having us, as well as the interns on the call, because this is for you. So, and Morgan alluded to, I was an intern or principal. I took a small hiatus in the middle before we relocated back to Iowa. But yeah, I did start as an intern, and I actually lead the team now that I interned on several years ago. So there's hope for all of us. We can make it. I think Zach said the phrase "setting the stage," and I like that. So a little bit about principle, just to understand the scope of what we're talking about. And I'll talk a little bit more on scope, and I'll make sure I kind of foot stomp those emerging trend things for the third-party space as I get to them. But principle's been around for about 143 years. Of the Fortune 500, I think last check, we fell at about 206. And what we're protecting is about $714 billion under management. So there's a lot at stake for our 51 million customers. And we have a lot of folks that are on board to help protect that and to work with those customers, including 18,000 employees across the globe. So third party for us is beyond domestic, it's international. With our offices in Asia, I think it's important to know them. So Asia, Australia, Europe, Latin America, as well as the United States. So truly a global scale that we're trying to work for and manage third parties with. My team sits under the governance, risk, and compliance umbrella. And like we talked about in the introduction, I'm responsible for evaluation of the cyber controls for third parties that do business with Principal. It's kind of its subsidiaries, I guess. So third parties is one of the words, vendors, suppliers, by many names, and we can have a discussion on semantics later about the difference of those terms. Not super important for this talk, but there's a little bit between them. And we're going to talk a little bit about the impact on, I think we talked about production, supply chain was mentioned by Zach. Reputational risk is something we try to balance because that reputational risk can lead to financial loss for not just us as a company, but ultimately for those that we serve and our customers, which is why we do what we do. There's a few things that we see in my space, which I think are pretty cool. And one of them is all the technology that Principal buys before we put it in production. So I enjoy seeing all of those unique vendors and third parties that we get to do business with and the different technologies that they're impacting, whether they're either for us in the cybersecurity space or across our business partners. So there's a little plug for the third party is a cool area to work if you're undecided. I'm going to reference a few data points or metrics throughout kind of my prepared comments, and they come from a Black Kite research item. Black Kite is a company that does a little bit of work in that third party space, but they were looking at different third-party security incidents. Across 81 of them, that led to 200 publicly disclosed breaches, right? So they looked at 81 things. And if we're thinking about, the principal company that has to disclose, I say the word principal sometimes, and I don't mean our company, just to be clear. So marketing doesn't yell at me, but we'll say the one to many, the one in the company, right? They have to disclose the breach of their data, but this occurred at a third party, right? So to go from 81 to 200, there's some ripple effects. And the management of those third parties is not just for us in cyber. It stretches across multiple risk domains. So operational risk, privacy, our partners in the financial area, understanding the financial solvency of these third parties. They're going to be around to provide the critical service we rely on day after day, again, for those customers, as well as ESG. ESG is an emerging topic for us in the third party space. So environmental, social governance. It's something that we're asking our vendors to care about. It's something we care about. And those reactions are, across our industry, right? They stretch up to the boardroom and out to our shareholders. If you're a publicly traded company, there are things that maybe you as consumers of products care about as well. You might take a look at a company or ask when you're applying, what are your policies and procedures around ESG? So definitely an emerging trend and hot topic for us in the third-party space. So doing our best to manage that across that diverse ecosystem. And I gave you some of those facts and figures about Principal to help kind of set the picture and paint a picture, I guess, for you as the scale of what it is we work to manage. You can kind of imagine it as maybe throwing a stone in a still lake, right? We're going to talk about the ripple effect. So the primary company being the stone drop, you're going to see the ripples out and out and out. Third parties, fourth parties, nth parties, and those circles get bigger and bigger, and the scope grows larger as you're trying to manage, outside of your four walls of the company and have conversations with your third and fourth parties to secure the data wherever it goes. In tying back to Zach's presentation, ransomware was the #1 third-party attack method in 2021. I think the black kite number was about 27%. Other areas where third parties, play into conversations, purchasing decisions, right? For we as Principal, we have a lot of clients that are very large, and they come to us looking at our security practices across the board, but also how we manage and evaluate our third parties, and in some cases, how our third parties are evaluating theirs, right? Our fourth parties, following the trail of the access and where the data goes. Those jumbo clients, as we like to call them, care a great deal, as do our shareholders and customers, right? It matters where the data goes and who has access to it, and that we're doing a good job, due diligence, due care to make sure that data is covered. I think the next good topic is software bill of materials related to kind of emerging trends. So the top breached, third-party companies were those third-party software publishers. Again, I feel like Zach and I planned this all out, but we didn't. So I'm going to give us extra credit, right? He mentioned that you can attack a single company that is a vendor or a supplier of a service to, a lot of large firms, and you're going to impact them all through that software. So a software bill of material, an SBOM, maybe you can ring a bell for things like Log4j, right? Kaseya, but they're incredibly impactful. But what they are is, for us as Principal, asking for a software bill of materials from our vendors to understand what version are you running and what's the patch level. So not only when there's an incident, can we run through our own house and our list to make sure we're covering our bases, but understanding where our vendors are, where they have access, and if we need to help them put in compensating controls to address the issues as they kind of, spin up rather quickly in the last few years. Got a couple real world examples. We'll wrap up and then we'll pivot over to some questions. So one that we dealt with in the last year was the Ukrainian conflict and its impact on our third-party space. So within Principal's walls, we quickly needed to understand not just what vendors are from either the two countries involved, but those in just surrounding areas. But what services I think maybe helped with them, right? So they may not be direct consumers or direct supporters of the product, but do they do some coding for them? Do they help maintain a system? Are they some type of customer contact? There's a lot of development resources in Ukraine. So to manage across the risk domains I mentioned earlier, right? Privacy, operational risk, et cetera. We had to come together rather quickly to understand where those impacts were, where we're being supported from, and if there was any action we needed to take. As people were worried about their safety, and we wanted to make sure that's first and foremost and support where we could. And the next, I think, topic I'd like to touch on is just a case study. So a little bit of public health information involved in this one too. So a defined benefit provider, it's something that Principal does as well. This is not related to Principal, but, and I'll tell you who it is at the end so you can ponder a little bit. So it was a breach and affected 38,000 individuals. The company had an internal investigation. Another fun fact from the Black Kite research was the average attack to disclosure timeframe for 2021 was 75 days. So that internal investigation can be a pretty big window post-attack. What was lost or compromised in that attack from those 38,000 individuals was social security number, name, date of birth, and some public health information. Where that landed, similar to some of the ransomware events that Zach talked about, was they paid money for them not to disclose or distribute that information. So this one was a little odder to me just because they had the information. It felt like, handing a criminal a 20 and saying, okay, now don't you go and tell anybody the bad thing I did. But ultimately, I think it worked out well for the company involved. And the company was the Major League Baseball Association, or the players area. This defined benefit plan, which is retirements that's done on behalf of the MLB, had a lot of sensitive information for some very high profile clients. So you can start to understand why maybe they did consider and make that payment in the end. But I'm probably on the side of I'm not going to pay, but I haven't had to have those high stakes conversations, right? It might be different in the moment, depends on reputational risk in that case was probably rather high, and the lawsuits that would trickle out of it. And so in closing, a little bit about what's next for our space and what's really emerging, right? Everyone's got vendors, everyone's got third parties. We're all shoving our way to the cloud, hand over fist as fast as we can go. But to understand the scope and really attempt to manage the third parties. Principal, for example, I have roughly 2,000 vendors, which I cyber assess, 3,000 engagements beneath them. Engagement is kind of like a subset of a vendor. So a vendor could have multiple products and services, and we want to take a look at those independently. And that's just a small fraction of what we have here at Principal. I think we do a pretty darn good job. I don't think we need to evaluate bills, lawn service, right? They're outside the building, cutting the grass. They're not going to connect to any data ports or have access to our facilities. So that's kind of where we draw the line. And what we won't, does it have data or access to our data, we're going to take a look at. So what we're trying to accomplish is real-time insights into those companies. So we work with different services that basically scan the internet to give us the attacker's point of view of all of the vendors which we care about, which we want to monitor in that respect. Our partners in the other risk domains are doing very similar work. We want to be alerted when there's executive turnover, when the CIOs and the CISOs are jumping ship, when we're having financial impacts, external attack scenarios like those Log4j and Kaseya's. We want to be first to hear through our news or data feeds, so that we can proactively reach out to those vendors, offer support, and make sure there's nothing that Principal needs to do to protect ultimately our customers. And I think with that, I think that's plenty about third parties. I think Zach and I are both happy to take your questions, whether it's about ransomware, third parties. I'm happy to answer anything I can about the Principal space, as well as our internships or certifications. I think are really anything's open. So I'll turn it back over to you, Morgan.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you to Zach and Sam. We did just get a question in, and I've got a few myself. So, but how does open source software play into this? And so I think, Sam, this is more for you, but when there's not a defined vendor to engage, that's a challenge we run into as well. So absolutely.
I'd say the first way that we attack it, and I'm throwing a couple things in the chat. Earlier, I referenced some metrics about Principal. You can do some research as well as the black hat information, but open source software is challenging, right? You can put a lot of technical controls in place to make sure people can only get to approved softwares. Someone's always going to find a way to get something downloaded. We have a really amazing and dedicated legal team. So one of the first things we're concerned about is what type of access do they have to our information when we're using those open source softwares, right? Do they lay right to the work we do on their platform or what we're sharing with them, or do they have some type of data connection that's going to siphon off information that we just wouldn't want leaving the building? It is a task across multiple domains in the information security space to make sure we vet and validate very useful open source solutions, right? Not everything has to be paid for. Some of the best ones are contributed from just the open source community. And we're trying to be good stewards of that in our software development world and contribute externally and internally. So we have an open software kind of service in the building where people can contribute and share and reuse code in the building to help kind of scratch the itch, if you will, a little bit for some of that information. But no silver bullet. It's a hard space to live in. I don't know, Zach, if there's anything you'd like to add to that.
No, I think I really, I think you've said this a couple of times that it feels way more coordinated between us than what we intended. I'm like, you just knocked it out of the park on exactly what I would have said. So I think that's phenomenal. One of the kind of the yes ands that I would include is I think there's a lot of questions about this, just within the industry, and a lot of people are struggling with this. And so we've heard of a couple of cases where like the Department of Homeland Security is trying to convene groups to talk about how do we better secure open source software. And it'll be interesting to see what those initiatives do, because traditionally we don't think of the government, we're from the government, we're here to help. We don't think that they're necessarily gonna be a big player in the open source community, but maybe that does help.
Hard when that piece of software is when it's included in almost every major industry and application across the board, right?
I would also add, just before we move on, Sam, I think that this is a emphasizes the importance of that bill of materials that you referenced, because most companies, when you're building software in our industry, do you even know what third-party open source software is built into your own application?
Yeah.
So reviewing and monitoring that bill of material and putting those checks in place around what our developers can download and what can get built into our own software is important. And it's the same challenge too when you look at that third and fourth level vendors too. I mean, okay, we use a piece of software that's commercial. What open source went into their product that we just paid for?
Yeah, there's always that unknown of, well, they're disclosing, but maybe to your point, they don't necessarily know what's going into theirs either. Maybe there's a gap. Like I said,
Yeah.
Software developers can grab what's necessary to get the job done, and they will.
Another question around the ransomware, what would you say is the best method to teach end users to stay vigilant towards these attacks? That's a good question here. Let's get back to how do we train those users?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm going to kind of answer it in twofold. The first is, I think you can always have part of your security awareness campaign or security awareness program, concepts like if you see something, say something, or, making sure that you don't assume that odd behavior is, just somebody else's problem, and make sure you're notifying the security team if you see something odd. I think those are really useful because one of the things we found is, as much as we would love to empower individuals to, recognize the signs of ransomware and become experts in, detecting ransomware, just by virtue of their job, they don't necessarily have the full picture. And so what our preference is, and I think this makes a lot of sense, is make sure that information, those odd behaviors, get reported up. And that's kind of evidenced in some of the incidents that we've heard about from peer institutions as well, where the thing that triggered their incident response was somebody finally contacting the security team saying, hey, I'm seeing a lot of weird stuff on this server. And the security team, coming in and taking that in compilation with other things that they'd seen and saying, hey, we're in the middle of an incident here. We need to start incident response. So I think that's a key piece of it. The second one, to kind of move it away from end users, is thinking about what detections exist for you for you to be able to detect ransomware independent of the users, right? A lot of organizations that we work for or will work for in the future do not work 24/7, 365 in all areas of the organization. So if something were to happen at 3 a.m. in your organization, what's going to tell you that encryption is now started to roll through, your network storage? That's a really hard question, but I think it's also a really good question for security teams to ask themselves. Because if you do start to build those detections and build those alerting capabilities, it doesn't take away from what those users can do and the benefit that they can provide you by notifying you. But it augments it, makes it maybe a little bit more robust. So I'd always encourage that as well.
I do have a question I want to get to before the end, but if they keep coming in through the chat, I'll keep reading them off. But here's a second one, or another one. Zach, I think for you around the ransomware, they did a quick search on the cost of information on the dark web, and they believe it's actually the social security number that was $4 a pop instead of the credit cards. Credit cards are usually about 1/100th the cost of the credit card balance, which I guess actually kind of makes sense. Actually, if you could post the reference, that would be awesome. So that $10 of information on the credit card with a $1,000 limit. So it's actually partially tied back to the balance of the credit card. Yeah, any thoughts on how does that change how people value? It's not just a simple algebraic equation anymore, is it? Really, right? When you're looking at the value of your data, when that's what's driving the black market cost.
Yeah, and so I did figure out thanks for correcting me on the social versus the credit card information. It was a trust wave report from 2018 that listed the 250 for medical record. So I wish I had a link that I could post. Sam's been doing a really good job of posting stuff. I feel like I need to catch up here, but yeah, if you want to go look that up, it's a trust wave report from 2018. I think one of the things that we're going to start to see is you can, as I kind of said, that criminal organizations and cyber criminals kind of mirror industry. Well, what's happened in industry over the last couple of years? The emergence of things like machine learning has just exploded in big data. And as we start to see criminal organizations adapt to that, I think, just like Morgan said, it's not going to be a linear scale anymore. I think you're going to see, a lot more nuance to the data that gets captured and the data that's used by these criminal organizations and the value that's associated with it. So it may not necessarily be that an individual record costs X. It may be more of this bucket of a billion records, costs $10 million. And as we start to see some of that emerge, that's going to be, a change for us in terms of defending against it.
So this is a question from me, and it's probably not going to be first and foremost on the minds of maybe an intern, but something to think about. And I'm curious both of your thoughts on this cyber insurance, right? I was in a forum not too long ago with other people in cybersecurity and talking about the changes over the last few years around what it takes to get cyber insurance and the value that it adds. And ransomware was a big part of that conversation because that's first and foremost in a lot of these insurers' minds. But I'm curious about that aspect, Zach, but also, are we starting to see trends around cybersecurity insurance providers looking at third-party risk management? I'm not really aware of those. I'm curious because that I would think that would be something that's coming next from the carriers.
Yeah, and I think Sam may actually be better qualified to talk about some of the liability insurance, just given the industry he's in and the experiences he's had. So I'll defer to him on some of the heavy lifting here. But I would say, and I'm kind of taking a step back here as like the political science guy. But if you think about how electricity started in the U.S., right? People had electricity, and then after a while, they were like, "Hey, we're having too many fires because of all the electricity that people are running in their houses." So they come up with the National Electric Code, which was a trade standard, right? And eventually the government said, hey, we should adopt that and make that part of the building code that's required for when people are building new buildings. But it was really this kind of synergy between insurers and industry saying we need to do something to be more safe. And then eventually the government coming in and saying, yeah, we agree, and that needs to be, regulated. And so I think we're starting to see the same thing here, right? That insurers are starting to realize there's probably some standards that we need to apply. And the best way to do that is through how we're insuring people and through the requirements we have to provide coverage. But we're also going to see industry standards. We already see those through like the NIST publications, and we're going to see government standards that also emerge. And that synergy between them, I think, is ultimately where we end up. So I don't think it's just the insurance industry that drives the train. It'll probably be kind of a mix. And Sam, I'll completely defer to your expertise on this.
No, I agree. I think there'll be some juxtaposition between the two, right? Where government's going to have some help maybe in the standardization of what some of this is. But I think Morgan, you poked at something important. And that's why do these insurance companies, or do they even care about third parties? I can tell you they do. I've seen it firsthand where they're saying, what do you use? And here is an incredibly large checklist of tell me all of the different vendors and solutions that are in your building, right? They're looking for some good, some bad, I'm guessing, right? There's some expectations that some of these are going to be in place, and they want an understanding of it, just like we want an understanding of it from our third parties, right? Because that's the fourth party to the insured policy, right? They care all the way down the chain what's happening. It's far from a perfect science at this point. The questionnaires and sometimes and the work to get through them is all over the place from what I've seen, but I think they're getting better. They're getting to a place where they're asking some more of the right questions, and sometimes you garner a little bit from them about maybe what you should be asking as well. But definitely a growing and emerging place, especially in our industry.
Awesome. So switching gears just a little bit, what would you suggest new professionals in the security industry use to stay up to date on emerging threats, tips, or key sources that you often use?
Yeah, I can start this one, Zach, and kick it over to you. I think there's a lot of good free resources, right, that you can subscribe to. One is, emerging things would be CVEs, right? Issues that are actively occurring. You can subscribe to those feeds. There are a lot of really awesome podcasts, to be honest, right? That are usually accompanied by reading. So if you like to read, you can consume it that way. I'm a big fan of the SANS Storm Center, mostly because it's about 5 minutes long. I can get it really quick, like on my walk from the car into the office, understand what the big things are going on. But I think the biggest foot down for me is one source isn't enough. You need multiple, just like you do with any other news outlet. You need to have different feeds coming in. So find what areas are interesting to you, areas that impact you, and they might not be cyber specific, right? There might just be some external sources that are directionally towards the area, either your industry or towards the field that you're in, that are really incredibly helpful. And the last thing would be just organizations. Students, you as interns, can usually get discounted rates to a lot of different really good resources. ISE Squared, ISACA, et cetera, have student programs where you can subscribe and you get newsletters and information through those as well. And also a great place to find some job postings as well. Zach?
Yeah, the unique approach that I'm going to advocate for is Twitter, which, everybody in the industry, the second you say Twitter, they're like, oh yeah, absolutely. But sometimes it kind of gets lost for some of the more junior staff, that they don't think of that as necessarily a valid source. But they just did a study a couple it was either a year ago or a couple of months ago. A lot of people publish like CVE rankings to say like these are the most high risk CVEs that an organization needs to pay attention to. You'll get these from security vendors and stuff like that. The best CVE ranking based on actual impact to the industry was a compilation of basically how much it was talked about on Twitter. And so somebody created a website called cvetrends.com that literally just pulls together how many times people are talking about these CVEs on Twitter and kind of ranks them that way. It's super effective. But it's not just for CVEs, new things that people are seeing and, indicators that people are seeing. Twitter's often the place where, you can see a lot of that information really quickly. But a lot of it's also the same thing Sam said. The two that I'd also bring up are Department of Homeland Security, CISA, their alerts. They've done a really good job, especially over the last couple of years, of just pushing out information. Hey, we're seeing this threat group from, this other country, and hey, this is what their TTPs are, and the techniques that they use. And security vendors also do a really good job with this in their blogs. And so, if you know of a major security vendor, whether it's Palo Alto or Mandiant or we just roll those off for 100 of them, but almost all of them will have a blog that they maintain, and they'll just push new information out on a regular basis. And those tend to be really in depth and are really useful for kind of understanding how the industry thinks about these different threats and the indicators associated.
I'm embarrassed I didn't say Twitter first.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
I'm embarrassed I didn't say Twitter first.
Right.
I might add too that we're security professionals, but we're also, I guess, maybe first and foremost, we're technology people and professionals, and sometimes just plugging into and staying aware of or on top of where technology is going is going to help you think about, you ask the right questions or think critically about, okay, where's security going? And that's kind of the topic here, those emerging trends, it follows the technology.
Yeah, for that, I love to follow the Verge for my technology stuff, just to see what new toys are coming out, right? And to your point, the security will follow very quickly behind it, how we compromise those new things we're going to plug into our houses and lives.
Any other questions from the chat, or if not, I'll come up with a few. One thing I'm curious about, Sam, from in your experience with, your part of the organization is primarily focused around security, cyber risk, but you talked about the multiple domains that really are affected by the investing in other technology, right? So there's legal risk and business risks associated with, say maybe getting in partnering with a vendor that actually turns out to not be solvent or reliable. How closely do you work with those other areas of the organization that are invested in those other areas of risk?
Yeah,
Does that look like?
I would say constantly, or as close to constantly as possible. Indicators aren't always going to come to us in the cyber world, right? We have peers in procurement, like you said, law, op risk, privacy. They're going to see different things. They're going to ask different questions and be concerned about different things. And when we come together to discuss those vendors, at the end of an engagement or onboarding, kind of ceremony, I might not have the red flag, right? I might say, man, A+, green light, let's go forward. And, another discipline might say, yeah, but, did you think about this and this, which may cause us to go back and ask some additional questions, take a different perspective to make sure that ultimately our business is aware of the risk. There where the decision lies, we want them to have the best information and data possible to make the best decision, right? It's a risk reward for them. They're willing to take risk to get the reward, but they need to be aware of what the risk is so they can make that informed decision. So again, constantly, there's a lot to there and a lot of automation that's behind it too, right? From an alerting other peers and risk disciplines perspective as well.
Do you feel like you have your area of risk has the right level of veto power, say, over vendors? I mean, I get it. The business says, oh, this is not a good business decision. We're not going to, deal with this vendor. It feels like sometimes in a lot of organizations, they have they're more willing to accept the security risk that might come with a vendor than they are some of that business risk.
Yeah, what we like to do is we never say no, right? We say yes, but, and we have excellent escalation paths, right? The whole point is communication and understanding, right? Did we do an okay job articulating the risk that's being presented to the business? Do they understand not only the risk presented for this singular engagement, but let's also take a look at aggregate risk, right? We have multiple business units at Principal. We can look at the risks that are stacking up in particular areas and categories, right? You're accepting a lot of risk in this particular space. Does that meet your risk tolerance, your threshold for risk? Making sure that those are established and understood so we can, again, have that good conversation decision. Right? Ultimately, it's going to go to the business. Our job is to raise up and communicate what it is and the why, why it's impactful, what could happen. But I don't think veto is in our language necessarily. Channels and appropriate people assigned to it are where it goes.
Yeah, communicate the risk as best you can, right? So one more from me, I think, Zach, I'm just curious. I'm fascinated by the challenges of protecting a hospital from ransomware because it's a huge high priority target. We hear about hospitals getting hit. I mean, most people, not everyone's going to work at a hospital or in such a heavily regulated industry or with such sensitive data. But yet, as you mentioned, anybody can be a target of ransomware. They're hitting a lot of, even the nation state ransomware type groups are hitting what seems like low hanging fruit. So what are the best recommendations for people joining any industry as a security professional, and what can they do to help protect their organization as best they can?
Yeah, it's a great question. And far be it from me to be the expert on this. I'd recommend people go to the DHS CISA page, and they actually have some really good guidance documentation on, hey, here's our, top 10 recommendations for minimizing the risk of ransomware, which is kind of the short version. I think there's a couple of categories that play into it. The first is having solid authentication mechanisms, including multi-factor. That does a great job in terms of minimizing kind of the risks associated with lateral movement that we see as kind of those precursor steps for ransomware. The other big one that I think gets a lot of organizations is not having isolated and secure backups. And so, the second that the ransomware event occurs, that's the data. They don't have a solid backup to continue operations off of, or continue their business moving forward. And then there's some of the kind of ancillary ones that are, I think, more dependent on the size of your organization. But generally, that principle of separation of duties and least privilege, those kind of two concepts, I think you can apply in a lot of different ways. I think separation of duties and least privilege also applies to things like network segmentation. And so, saying, hey, we're going to isolate different activities for the business into different areas, that's where a lot of that danger occurs, is that you have somebody that doesn't need access to the financial records database, but because you don't have that segmentation, an attacker is able to move into it. So that was the super short version, but the right answer is, go look it up on the DHS CISA page, because they're the experts, not me. So